Hi, this is Laura from The Eye Without the Disorder. Today I'm going to talk to Veronica Heney, who is a researcher at the Durham University in the departments of Sociology and Medical Humanities. Veronica works at the intersection of social science and literary studies, exploring narratives and experiences of madness and mental distress. Today's interview is going to be about a PhD study, which looked at the portrayals of self-harm in fiction and how these portrayals had impacted people who had self-harmed. We are also going to take a short look at her current study, which is about anxiety being portrayed in fiction. This is the first part of this interview. Enjoy.
So, hi, Veronica. Thank you for coming to my interview. And could you please give us a short introduction of yourself and tell us a bit about your PhD?
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. First of all, I'm really pleased to be here and to be talking to you. So, as you said, I'm Veronica. I am currently a research fellow at Durham University at the Institute for Medical Humanities there, where I'm in a 2-year postdoc doing a project around narratives and experiences of anxiety. And that's really part of my broader work, which is around narratives and experiences of mental health or madness, more widely understood, where I'm interested in how we come to understand our own experiences, what shapes the ways we understand them, and particularly like how fiction impacts that. I'm interested in the stories we tell and how they come to be told, and what they come to mean in our lives and how they come to impact our lives. Just to give the most general introduction, and what that means is that I generally do research that's sort of at the middle of literary studies or cultural studies and medical sociology. So I use methods from both of those disciplines. Like I look at a lot of fictional texts, but I also conduct interviews, and I try to think about how those things might come together.
Wow.
In my PhD, I applied that specifically to the topic of self-harm. So I interviewed 16 or 17 people about who had experienced self-harm, and I asked them what they thought about how self-harm was represented in fiction, and how they experienced those depictions and how those depictions impacted them. I hope that's an introduction that makes sense.
Absolutely, and it sounds really exciting. There are so many questions that I could follow up with this, but let's stick to your PhD. So when I first read about your second study, and that was how I got to know you and read about your work, I was just so sort of really mind blown about just the idea of connecting literary studies and fiction with mental health questions and psychology. And I just still think it's such a brilliant idea to combine these two things. It's sort of like a little bit of what I always do in my head when I watch or read something. So I think it's amazing that someone is studying this. And with your PhD, I was really curious, if you're comfortable to talk about it, how you had the idea for that. How did you have this idea of combining these two subjects?
Yeah, I like thinking about this answer because I think I'm lucky in that I loved doing my PhD, even in the times it was hard, and remained really enthusiastic about the idea and felt very lucky to get to do something I was so passionate about. And I think, in fact, the way I came to that topic and that approach came from two different places at once. And one was a little more academic and one was a little more personal. And the academic approach was that I'm interested more generally in how fiction impacts experiences, or in how fiction and experiences might intersect. And when I was trying to research what there'd already been that was written about how self-harm was depicted in fiction, I read all these things that were sort of making these quite clear statements, like that were saying like, oh, well, these are good depictions and these are bad depictions. And that were like saying, well, these depictions will help people recover and these depictions probably won't. And it was kind of baffling to me because a lot of these things were written, they were just based off of theories. And sometimes I might even have agreed with them, but they were still based off of like psychological theories rather than ever talking to anybody who'd self-harmed. And
Yeah.
I found it really frustrating. I was like, you're making some really big assumptions about what people will think and what they'll feel. And as somebody who is, I didn't do a sociology undergraduate degree, but I had been more and more involved in sociology afterwards and was like really interested in this idea of interviewing people and talking to people. And as somebody who had like done some work in that context, I just was baffled that nobody had ever thought to just ask people. Because that's one of the things I love doing. It's like, it's the thing I love about sociology is sometimes if you want to find something out, it's as easy as asking people. And I thought that would be a really like interesting way of finding out if these assumptions people were making were right or if things were a bit more complicated, as I suspected they might be.
Yeah.
And then the flip side of that is there's a personal context wherein when I was a teenager, I was self-harming, and it was a difficult experience in like many of the usual ways that you would assume, perhaps. But it felt very difficult to me because it was an experience that I was like very actively participating in, obviously, but one that I didn't feel like I was fully understanding. And moreover, that there was a part of my life now that was inexplicable both to me and to everybody around me. And I remembered I had this dual sense of like feeling like there was this part of my life that I had no story for in a way that I had never experienced before, because I was a person who was really brought up like with and by books. I read all the time. I was obsessed with stories. I always have been. And so it felt very strange. And it also, I remember very clearly a moment in which I did encounter a story that felt like it came very close to me and to what I was experiencing. And what I remember really clearly is it was a film I watched with some friends, and I loved it and was really drawn into it. And they were horrified by it and thought it was very weird.
Oh my God.
It made me really like, I was really drawn to this way that like a narrative can become really important and it can hit the nail on the head about something. And yet it can be like a totally personal experience that doesn't translate to other people. So I felt like there was something interesting amongst all the complexities of those sorts of the academic parts and the political parts and the personal parts. And I'm always drawn to things that are a little complicated.
That sounds really interesting. And I'm so glad you had this idea and did this study. And I'm wondering how you found participants. I think you already mentioned that you had about 16 or 17 participants. And I'm curious to know how you found these people and whether you had any sort of idea who you wanted to ask, or if it was just completely open, and what sort of demographics were represented in the interviews.
Yeah. So in fact, I had a couple of different ideas for how I might recruit people, but actually what I started by doing was putting an advert out on Twitter. And I sort of tagged some organizations that I knew that were like involved in activism around mental health, and they shared the advert. And actually, although I recruited, at the time I felt like I recruited quite fast, but in comparison to other recruitment I've done, it wasn't overly fast. But I felt like I talked to plenty of people and didn't struggle actually as much for recruitment as I might have done. And I didn't, I was sort of aware of thinking about demographics and collected information about demographics, mostly because I wanted to give a sense of each individual as a person, and because I wanted to be honest about the sorts of people I was talking to. I had an awareness that like it was going to be a very small sample, so it wouldn't necessarily be completely representative, and that it wouldn't be like trying to do a large survey where I'm trying to like gain an objective perspective. I was talking to 16 individuals out of a community of like just thousands, and that each perspective was going to be very specific. And I didn't mind that. But I was trying to think a little about demographics. So I would say certainly the survey was like a little the group of people I talked to was a little imbalanced, as you might expect, in terms of both self-harm as a grouping and in terms of research, and specifically mental health research more generally. It was a little imbalanced in favor of white women, a little middle class, but I certainly spoke to plenty of people who either had working class backgrounds or were in a working class context currently. And I spoke to a couple of people of color, and I spoke to one man, who I was very delighted to recruit. And so although it's not that there was like balance achieved between the different demographics, there wasn't a demographic that I felt was particularly excluded. And that was very good, and I was very pleased with that, actually.
Okay, so that's very interesting, because I imagine that if you really wanted to have like a representative study where all the demographics are represented, I guess you would have to go you would have to have a much bigger approach and to reach everyone, because I imagine that, you know, the way you try to find participants, the media that you use, that will already determine who is going to even see that and show up, I guess.
Absolutely. Like these things are very imperfect. And to me, that's an important part of the study and I mean, to me, it's part of the benefit of doing the sort of work that I do that isn't trying to make large generalizations and would ever be used, for instance, as the basis for like, this wouldn't be a good evidence base for instance, changing clinical practice. Like this is how you could run a clinical trial. But that's not at all what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to talk to some people and see what they had to say. And they had very interesting things to say. So I felt good about who I recruited. I think if it had been, for instance, a sample of people that was entirely white or entirely middle class or something like that, that would have concerned me. But because it wasn't, actually, like once you have a sample of like such a small sample, you're kind of weighing up questions of like, well, am I trying to replicate the balance of the population? Am I trying to achieve like parity between different demographic groups, even though they're not represented equally within the broader UK population context? Am I trying to replicate the balance of population within people who self-harm, which is actually probably a population we don't have great demographic statistics for? So it's like, actually, you can kind of tie yourself in knots trying to achieve something that might not be achievable or knowable. Whereas I feel like for the sort of like small scale qualitative studies, you want to try to get a good balance if you can and try to talk to a variety of people. And then you want to be really like honest and clear about how you frame that information when you're publishing it.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good approach to me, to have that awareness and not to try to accomplish the impossible and to do the best with what you can do. So can you tell us a bit more about what the interviews were actually like? I'm sort of curious to know if there was maybe something that all of them had in common or something that kept coming up, something like that?
Yes, I mean, the thing I can say to begin with is that the interviews were fascinating. I really enjoy is perhaps the wrong word, although maybe it's not. I really valued every person I spoke to. I was really lucky. I feel like it must have been just very good luck. Every person I spoke to was incredibly thoughtful, like just came with really interesting things to say, and a real generosity. I think what became clear, and there are certain like more straightforward things to say, which I will say in a second, but what became clear to me through doing the interviews is that self-harm is a complex experience, and one around which there can be a lot of uncertainty. And the people I talked to had a huge amount of generosity around like being generous with their own uncertainties and the things that they found complex, but also a real awareness that like what they'd experienced and what they believed or what they felt might not be what other people believed and experienced and felt. And so brought a real sense of nuance to it. So in terms of that, just all the interviews were really wonderful. But in terms of what people had to say, there were a lot of things that came up. So the first thing was just that people felt that self-harm wasn't represented very much at all. That there were several people who perhaps only seen self-harm represented once. People had a sense that I'd entered into the research with, and so it was interesting to see them share it. They had a sense of some of the difficulties around the representation of self-harm. Sometimes they felt that authors and creators avoided it, that like it was seen as a difficult topic or a dangerous topic. Alternatively, sometimes they felt like people entered into it almost too lightly, that they were a bit irresponsible, that they used it for shock value or for drama, that they weren't very thoughtful in how they were representing it. There was a lot of concern that they weren't very accurate in how they were representing it, that there were a lot of, that a lot of fiction missed the point. Or worse, kind of dealt in stereotypes and incorrect assumptions. People had a real sense that representations of self-harm could be very harmful, that they could impact how you felt about yourself, but more importantly, that they impacted how people saw you and how people might treat you, and that really concerned people. But there was also a sense that like representations that felt good or felt true and accurate were incredibly meaningful to people. People talked really movingly about the ways that different representations had meaning for them, the things that they felt were really valuable, feeling close to characters, feeling understood. One person, which I will always remember, talked about a story where she'd seen a character go and ask for help from someone at their school, and that because of reading that, she'd had the courage to go and ask for help from someone from her school, and had felt like that help was really valuable. So I don't know if that quite answers your question. It's quite a broad summary. Those are the things that came up quite a lot.
Yeah, it actually also answers the next question that I had. So it's brilliant. And I really love hearing these stories of what people shared. And I just always feel so, like you, I feel that people are being very generous and to make themselves so vulnerable and share all of these very personal and maybe frightening experiences that they might not even understand themselves. But I think it's so amazing that they want to share this and want to help, maybe create a world where this gets depicted better, by voicing their opinion and speaking about what they would love to see and what they need and how they would like to be represented. I think that's so valuable for really trying to do something about the state of things and maybe doing better. So I think it's very brave and generous of the people, and I love hearing about it.
I certainly thought they were all incredibly brave and incredibly just wonderful to talk to. I really enjoyed those conversations. But they were very brave and very generous. And I recognized lots of things are difficult to talk about, but in fact, one of the biggest awarenesses that I came into the research with was a sense that self-harm was difficult to talk about in very particular ways. That made it extremely hard. And certainly I knew in those conversations, for some people, they might never have talked about self-harm in that way. And in fact, for me, right, it was quite similar for me. I had experiences of self-harm for a long time, but basically never talked about them. And so these conversations were new for me as well. And the conversations we were able to have felt very, it felt like there weren't a lot of other spaces in which we might have been able to have them. They were very precious to me, and I was very grateful that that people I talked to chose to trust me like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think I would feel the same. I mean, it would be really difficult for me too, to talk about my experiences of self-harm. And I think for this particular study also, I would have really wanted to join in, but I actually don't know any type of fiction where I came across of an example of self-harm. So I feel really sad about that now thinking about it, because it would be really great, but of course only if it was, represented in a way that I thought was accurate and sensitive and thoughtful, and not replicate any of those stereotypes that exist out there. And I just know that many times, or most of the time, when I read about the topic on the internet and mental health services that are trying to help, but most of the time I feel like they completely miss the point, and they replicate stereotypes without being aware of it. And it's just so harmful, this kind of ignorance. So I feel like what you're doing is exactly the right thing, that it needs to be people who have experience of self-harm to talk about this and educate the ones who want to help. They need to listen to the people who have the experience and what they need.
Well, thank you for saying that. I really agree. And I think that one of the things that came out very clearly for me was the way in which was two things. In which people who could be very well intentioned around self-harm, and often were, but could still get it quite wrong. And I think that's true both within like questions of representation and beyond that. But also just that what came through particularly clearly to me was just that there is so much complexity here, that any approach that tries to reduce, like that tries to say like, well, self-harm is always this, or like self-harm people who self-harm always feel this. And even beyond that, trying to think about like, oh, well, self-harm should be represented like this and shouldn't be like this. It was never, ever that simple. It was always complex. And in fact, it was often contradictory. And that made perfect sense to me, because that's been my experience of self-harm always, that it's complicated and that it's often more than one thing at once.
Absolutely.
And I felt like I really valued like this approach where I could talk to different people and I wasn't trying to like weigh their opinions against each other, that I could treat them all as kind of true in their own way. And I really valued that.
That's great.
This was the end of the first part of this interview. Please stay tuned for the second part.